My name is James Harris. When the events described here took place, I was 52 years old. I was married to the woman I loved, we had 2 grown children whom we raised properly, and I had a well-paying job that I enjoyed. I had the world by the tail, and life was wonderful until it wasn't. It all started on a Tuesday evening. That evening, I worked late, but not so late that my wife would worry, and I headed home after the rush hour traffic had cleared. It was my typical Tuesday evening. We had agreed that I would pick up some Chinese food on the way home, and that's exactly what I did. I parked in the garage, pressed the remote to close the door, gathered my briefcase and the food, and headed inside. I was like a mighty hunter returning to the cave to feed my hungry mate, or at least what passes for that in 21st century America. Almost immediately, I noticed that my wife's car wasn't in its usual spot, but I figured she must have stepped out for some last-minute errands and assumed she would be back soon. So, I left the food covered on the kitchen table, hoping to keep it warm, knowing that if she was delayed, we could always reheat it in the microwave. I walked down the hallway to the front door, turned at the staircase, and headed to our bedroom to change into something more comfortable. It was my usual weekday routine: come home, get comfortable, and eat. 10 minutes later, I was coming down the stairs and called out, "Marty? Are you home?" Nothing. I thought, where could she have gone? Maybe she left a note? I wasn't too worried, but by this point I was at least curious. I went into the living room and found a note on the coffee table. It wasn't the kind of note I was expecting, but it was the kind I could have never imagined. It read, "Dear Jim, I'm sorry to do this to you, but there's someone who needs me. I got a call today. It's the kind of call you have to respond to when it comes. I'm sorry I left without warning, and I know this will be hard for you, but please know that I love you more than life itself, and I'll come back as soon as I can. I cherish the life we've built together, and I hope to return to it when I can. Don't worry about me, I'll be fine. Your loving wife, Mari." On the coffee table next to the letter lay her cell phone. I was stunned and confused. I kept going over what I had read in her mysterious letter. She said someone needed her. Who needed her? Who could be so important yet not worth telling me who they were? Then panic set in. Where had she gone? How could it be so urgent that she couldn't tell me where she was going? How could she leave her phone behind? When would she be able to contact me? This wasn't the kind of note a wife leaves her husband if she's planning to return late in the evening. Panic turned into fear, and fear into anger. How the hell could she do this? She just runs off without explaining properly why and where she's going? Then darker thoughts crept into my mind, and the first question, how could she forget her cell phone, gave way to a second, why did she leave her cell phone? I read her note again, and the second time it told me no more than it had the first. There's someone who needs me. I got a call today. It's the kind of call you have to respond to when it comes. Who does she think she is? She's not a secret agent, not a super spy, not a neurosurgeon for the leaders of the damn free world. Where the hell is my wife? I admit in that moment, my anger was a mask for my fear. I was worried about my wife. Wherever she was, I was convinced she would need my help. I wanted to go to her, but where had she gone? I wanted to hear her voice and know she was okay, but I had no way to reach her. I just sat there, rereading her note while dinner grew cold and the sun set. When it got dark, I finally decided to start making calls. I called her sister, our friends, and eventually I called our children. No one knew anything or would tell me. Worst of all, I ended up just scaring our children. I tried to reassure them that nothing serious had happened, but I didn't do a very good job of it, so I hung up, promising to keep them informed. Now I was even angrier and blamed her for scaring our kids, even though I had a hand in that mistake. I reread the note again. I cherish the life we've built together, and I hope to return to it when I can. Those aren't the words of someone who will be home in a few hours or even days. Now I was truly scared, and though I kept telling myself I was overreacting, I called the hospital. She wasn't there. Then I called the police, but they told me I couldn't file a missing persons report until 48 hours had passed unless I was reporting a missing child. I thought about lying, but how could I tell them I wanted to report a child who was 5 feet 8 inches with chestnut hair who could easily pass for 38 even though she was 49? I thanked them and hung up. In the end, I tried to eat something, but I wasn't hungry, so I just put the food I bought in the fridge and sat in the dimly lit living room, hoping she would come back. She didn't. I went upstairs a little after 2 in the morning and fell into a deep sleep. When I woke up the next morning, I stretched and realized her side of the bed was cold and empty. It all came flooding back to me, and I lay there thinking, what should I do? I called work and said I wouldn't be coming in. My absence was so unusual that it seemed to cause some concern, and before I knew it, my phone was ringing with colleagues asking if I was okay, if I needed anything, if there was anything they could do, and what they should do about certain files. Honestly, trying to help them a little felt cleansing and, for a brief moment, it distracted me from my worries. I called her office, but they told me she had called in and taken the day off. I didn't think they were hiding anything from me, although for a while I did suspect that, but over time I became more convinced that they were as much in the dark as I was. I visited her office several times, hoping a face-to-face conversation would be more revealing, but they didn't know anything beyond what I already knew, which was practically nothing. She left sometime on Tuesday, but I didn't realize she was gone until late that evening, and the police needed 48 hours before I could file a report. So, on Friday morning, I went to the police station to report her as missing. I showed them her note, and they asked if she had done anything like this before. Yelling at the police isn't a good idea, but by that point, I wasn't in the best frame of mind. They threatened to charge me if I didn't calm down, so I forced myself to sit down before they decided I was a hot-headed suspect, and they filled out the form. Then they said, in most cases like this, the wife runs off with her boyfriend. You'll probably find out in a few days when you're served with divorce papers. Never in my life had I wanted to punch a police officer so badly. Instead, I just muttered, thanks for nothing, and walked out. So much for their motto, to protect and serve. I went back home and collapsed into a chair. I was being torn apart by stress. With nothing else to do, I resumed calling friends and relatives, but this time I was smart enough not to call the kids. Instead, they called me and I had to tell them that I still didn't know anything but that I was sure their mother was fine. She's smart, capable, and I was confident she had everything under control. In other words, I was lying to my kids. A father should never lie to his children, but I had nothing to tell them, nothing good or bad, other than that their mother was still missing. My calls to friends and relatives on Tuesday evening triggered a flood of calls to me on Wednesday. They started calmly with comments like, just checking in, but by Thursday they grew increasingly concerned. Everyone wanted to know what I was doing to find Mari, and by Friday the tone of some calls had taken on an unmistakable edge of aggression. No one had said it outright yet, but concern was slowly giving way to accusations. If the calls on Friday were bad, the visits on Saturday were unbearable. I was overwhelmed with visitors, friends, and family stopping by to see how I was doing. They always began with words of support, but soon the questions followed. Were there any problems between you two? Did you have any arguments? Was she unhappy? What finally broke me was when her mother asked, "Are you sure you don't know where she is?" I snapped and yelled at my mother-in-law for the first time since we'd known each other. "What kind of crap are you talking, Margaret? Are you accusing me of something? Do you really think I would lie about something like this?" No, Jim. Of course not. It's just..." She hesitated. "Spit it out, Margaret. Just what?" She looked me in the eye, and with an angry glare I will remember until the day I die, she said, "It's just that she's never done anything like this before." I shoved my anger and pain deep down, hoping they wouldn't resurface, and in the calmest voice I could manage, I said, "Do you think I don't know that?" By then, she was visibly shaking. Her husband said, "Jim, we know you're doing everything you can. Could you tell us what you know, and maybe we can figure something out?" I nodded, and we sat in silence for a while before I told them everything I knew, or rather, that I knew nothing. I showed them the note, and they were equally puzzled and worried. The thinly veiled accusations disappeared, and we spent a whole hour, shedding tears, trying to come up with anything at all, that could explain Mari's sudden disappearance, but we had nothing. Henry and Margaret stayed until lunch while I prepared a light meal for the three of us, or at least I thought it was for the three of us. Apparently, our friends had other ideas as there was a constant stream of people at the front door, some bringing food, others bringing beer, and everyone wanted to know what had happened and what I knew. At some point, I stopped telling the story. That's when Margaret and Henry stepped in. To their credit, the blame was taken off me, and she praised me for being a concerned husband. I know that, deep down, everyone had their own suspicions, but at least it felt like I had regained some support. I was truly overwhelmed as one well-wisher after another sat down with me to express their concern and support. I urged everyone to contact the police if they thought of anything that might help, but secretly, I believed that someone knew something they weren't telling me, and I hoped that information would reach the authorities, even if I never found out about it. As far as I could tell, no one knew anything, and aside from a few supporters who called the police to ask if they had any leads, nothing happened for several weeks. That is, nothing happened for exactly 2 weeks. The police had my wife's driver's license along with her car's make and model, and they added it to their watch list in case of potential car thefts. When I made remarks like, "I hope they find her car, and maybe they'll find her," people would glance at each other as if I didn't get it. But I did understand, and I knew what they were thinking. She ran away, and there's a good chance she won't want to come home, even if they find her. I tried going back to work, but I was useless there, and everyone told me to go home. So I went home and I was just as useless there. At first, I sat and made phone calls. Then I drove around the area looking for her car. I even drove past her friends' houses thinking maybe they were hiding her, though I couldn't imagine why. Day after day, I worried, called, drove around, and pestered the police but got nowhere. In a fit of desperation, I reached out to my lawyer to ask what I should do, and he connected me with a private investigator. Officially, the police said it was my right. Unofficially, I could tell they didn't like it. They told me that private investigators usually interfere and get in the way of official investigations, so I asked them, "And what do you have so far?" They had nothing, so I told them in what can politely be called direct language that I didn't think a private investigator could interfere with them finding nothing. They didn't like that, but they also couldn't argue. The private investigator was expensive and came back with exactly what the police had, nothing. As I mentioned, this happened 2 weeks after Mari disappeared. I was still doing the same things, making phone calls, driving around, and watching the news. But I also started checking Mari's social media, her credit card activity, and our bank accounts. There was nothing on the card until, 2 weeks later, money was withdrawn from an ATM in a town 200 miles away. I immediately called the police and informed them. That got their attention, and within half an hour, 2 detectives were at my door and the suspicion started again. Finally, I looked them in the eyes, and in the calmest voice I could manage, but which, in hindsight, was just one small step away from rage, I said, "No, I didn't go there, and I didn't use that card. I've been here in town the whole time. I've been calling friends, driving around looking for her car, and doing a hell of a lot more than any of you. Now you've got a lead, so get off your fat asses and follow it." They clearly didn't like me very much, and it was just as clear that I didn't care. But after half an hour of reassurances and veiled accusations, they finally left. To their credit, they did contact the police in that town and passed along the information about Mari and her car. 2 days later, her car was found in a hospital parking lot. The local police called me and said, "Don't do anything. Let us handle it." I responded like hell and drove there myself. Just over 3 hours later, I pulled into that parking lot. It took me about 2 minutes to find her car, though it felt like 2 hours. I also noticed 2 men in suits sitting in a car, practically screaming, "Cops." So I parked and walked over to them. I think they were expecting me. I showed them my driver's license and said, "Show me your badges." They looked at each other, clearly unhappy, but did as I asked. I knelt down and asked them to tell me what they knew, but all they knew was that they had the car and no one had approached it since they had arrived. When I said I was going to ask about my wife, they informed me that they had already asked. I thanked them with as much fake sincerity as I could muster and told them I was going to do it anyway. My tension was quickly building and I wasn't there to make friends. At the hospital reception, they didn't know my wife's name and had no information about the car parked outside, so I decided to join the stakeout. I had nothing to hide and everything to gain, so I asked to sit in the back seat of their car. It might have been the first time I surprised the police since all of this started, but they agreed and I joined them. Over the next hour, we talked and I briefly told them the little I knew. When their shift ended and it was time for them to leave, they agreed to let me keep an eye on the car, but they made one thing very clear. If someone comes for the car, whether they walk out of the hospital or drive up to it, do not intervene. Just call us and tell us the car is moving. Don't try to follow it. Don't do anything except call us. Understood? I nodded. Remember, there's a small chance that your wife is with them and they'll lead us to her, but there's a bigger chance they simply bought the car from someone and don't know anything. However, they might help us track down the person who sold them the car. It's very important that you don't do anything. Understand? For the first time since all of this started, I truly understood and agreed. I went back to my car, and for the next 3 hours I sat there hunched in the seat, watching Mari's car. The only time I left my post was for the quickest bathroom break in history. I was in and out of the hospital so fast that I was still zipping up my fly as I crossed the lobby. An hour later, I saw a woman approaching the car, and my heart stopped. I tried to catch my breath. That's Mari. She opened the car door and took out something small, then closed it and headed back toward the hospital. I followed her, keeping my distance. Something told me that if she knew I was here, I would never get to the truth. As we entered the hospital, I stayed about 20 meters behind her. I watched as she got into the elevator, which stopped on the 3rd floor. It wasn't long before I peeked into a room and saw her sitting by a man's bedside. He seemed to be either asleep or unconscious, and she was holding his hand. I cleared my throat, and when she turned and saw me standing in the doorway, my beloved and loving wife fainted. I was angry and confused, but I called a nurse who attended to her until she came to. Most of that time I spent studying the man in the bed. I had never seen him before. He was neither a friend nor a relative, just a man. But it was clear that to Mari he was more important than her marriage, more important than her family, and apparently more important than me. One mystery was solved and immediately another appeared. While the nurse was helping Mari off the floor, I took the opportunity to call the local detectives and let them know that my wife had been found. They told us to stay put and said they were on their way, so I gave them the room number. Life was starting to get very interesting, and as I looked at the man in the bed, I felt a cold chill in my heart where fear used to be. When Mari came to, she was nearly hysterical, shaking her head as I calmly and coldly asked her questions. "Why, Mari? Who is this man? Why did you run off like that? Why didn't you tell us where you were? Why didn't you let us know you were okay? Mari, what's going on, for God's sake?" A few times she looked as if she was about to answer, but then she would lower her head and start crying again. I stood there, waiting, asking questions, and wondering when the detectives would arrive. When they did, I stepped aside and let them take over, but they immediately asked me to leave the room. One of them joined me and asked a dozen questions. I just told him the truth, that I saw Mari approach the car, followed her, and then confronted her in the hospital room. Confronted might not have been the best choice of words, and I spent the next 5 minutes assuring him that I hadn't harmed her. When he found out that the nurse had found her lying on the floor, the questioning took on a more serious tone. All the while, his partner was speaking with Mari. Over time, I think I convinced them that I hadn't harmed my wife, or maybe she did. I don't know. They wanted me to leave, so I called out into the room, "Mari, if I walk out of here, I'm divorcing you. Do you understand me?" This set her off into hysterics again, and she begged me not to leave. I then looked the detective in the eye and said, "I'm not going anywhere until I get answers." Eventually, I was allowed back into the room. As quietly and calmly as I could, I began asking Mari the questions that were burning in my mind. Mari gave only vague half-answers. He was her high school boyfriend, her first love. He was dying and he had no one. Between those lines, there were long pages of information left unsaid, but all I could do was keep asking or guessing. "How have you been living here for 2 weeks without using your card?" She was silent for a long time before finally replying, "I've been staying at his house." "So you know where he lives?" "Of course." "And you have a key?" She nodded silently. "How long have you had a key to his house?" She shrugged in silence, staring at the floor. I knew that as soon as I made an accusation, I was risking hell if I turned out to be wrong. Still, 2 damn weeks is more than any man should have to wait for answers in the dark. "How long, Mari?" She didn't respond. "How long has the affair been going on?" She didn't answer the question, nor did she deny the accusation. In moments like that, the mind goes quiet. There would be time later for more questions and more pain. "All right, I think at the very least, you should show me his house. I want you to take me to where you've been staying." She looked at me in terror as panic overtook her. In the end, she gave in and nodded silently. She grabbed her coat and we headed to my car. "I'll drive you," I said, "and then I'll bring you back." She seemed surprised but agreed. By then, I think the detectives had decided it was a personal matter. With one last warning not to do anything foolish, they left. Mari remained mostly silent during the drive, only speaking when necessary to give directions. At one point, she whispered softly, "I was told we might be asked to compensate the police for the time they've wasted." I wanted to ask, "Who is this we you're talking about?" but I stayed silent. Only God knows what my pulse and blood pressure were at that moment. I could barely stand. As we pulled into the short driveway in front of the townhouse, I realized that inside, I would likely find the answers to my questions. Mari led us into the house, and as we walked through the living room, I immediately noticed a pair of my wife's shoes on the floor by the sofa. Her favorite scarf was draped over a chair. I started walking down the hallway when Mari called out, "James, please, don't go in there." If ever a wife's words had the opposite effect, it was in that moment. I walked into the master bedroom. Mari's clothes were scattered on the unmade bed and chair, and her makeup and other items were on the dresser. Only when I opened the closet and saw familiar dresses did my last doubts vanish. There was a blue dress, her favorite, but I knew for a fact that it was hanging in her closet at home. This was a duplicate. There were also several pairs of shoes, likely in her size and the style she liked. These weren't things she packed for a trip. These were things she kept here. Now, I had no doubts left, and I realized that if I opened a few drawers I would find her underwear and other personal items. The room seemed set up not for daily life, but for the occasional overnight stay, a dinner, some dancing, and then intimacy, followed by sleep in the arms of her lover. I returned to the living room, feeling shattered, and found Mari sitting quietly on the edge of a chair, staring aimlessly at the floor. "So, is there anything you want to tell me?" She just slowly shook her head. "How long, Mari?" It's obvious this isn't a platonic relationship. How long? She shrugged silently as if she didn't know the answer, but it was clear she did and didn't want to say. Who is he to you? She stayed silent for a long time, then finally answered in a quiet voice. He was my first. We were together when we were in school. I wondered if she meant high school or college, but both were a long time ago, and I decided it didn't matter. How long have you been seeing him behind my back? This made her flinch, but she couldn't deny it. She wanted to deny it, wanted it to be untrue, but we both knew it wasn't. We reconnected about 7 years ago. At first, it was just lunches, then dinners. One evening, when you were out of town, we went dancing. That was about a year before we. She trailed off. Before you had sex. She slowly nodded. So, you've been sleeping with him behind my back for 6 years? How did you do it? Did you come here? Or did he come to our house? This question triggered an immediate reaction in Mari. Her head snapped up. I never brought him to our house. I swear. I would never do that to you. I nodded, feeling the anger rise. So, you can sleep with him, but you won't entertain him in our home? Glad to know there's a line you won't cross. She got angry, but she couldn't deny anything. After a long silence, she said, I never stopped loving you. He never took anything away from you. I swear. It was just a few nights a year, and I always stayed with you forever. It was a lie straight out of a cheater's playbook, and I thought, what's the point in arguing? But there was a point. He took at least part of the love you claimed you had for me. You kept part of your heart for him. Because of him, you lied to me over and over again. You made vows to me, but you gave him a part of yourself that you said was only for me. Don't tell me he never took anything from me. He took everything, even if you don't think so. Mari was crying, and I stood silently beside her. I knew everything I needed to know. I thought about wrecking his house, smashing everything I could, but he wasn't coming back here. In the end, I just gave up. Let's go, Mari. I'll take you back to your lover's bedside. This brought on another round of tears, but my heart was broken and I had no comfort left to give her. I drove her back to the hospital, and as she got out of the car, she begged me, James, please, give me a little more time. He has no one. I can't let him die alone. I'll be home soon. The last sentence ended in a sob. I'll be home soon and we can go back to our life together. Please. I love you. I swear. I nodded silently and let her go, telling her that he was waiting for her. By then, I think she already understood that it was over between us. I drove home slowly for 4 hours and I don't remember any of it. I was devastated. 2 weeks of stress and worry, all those friends and relatives telling me not to lose hope, and now I found out that the whole time she had been with her lover. I was exhausted both physically and emotionally. I barely managed to stumble into the house and collapse into my favorite chair. I don't know how much time passed before the first call came. It was her parents, and they wanted to know where I'd been and if I'd found anything. That's when I realized I had driven 200 miles without telling anyone. I briefly considered sparing Mari from the embarrassment, but I must have used up the last remnants of my love for the woman who had betrayed me for years, so I told Henry and Margaret everything. They didn't want to believe it until I described what I found in his house. At that point, it didn't matter whether they believed me or not, my marriage was over. I knew it without needing to think about it. It was a fact that came from deep within my soul, crushing my heart and consuming me. It was over between me and Mari. She loves another man, and I'm not someone who shares. Worse yet, she spent years lying to me, sneaking around behind my back, and giving herself to him. This wasn't a mistake, it was a life of betrayal, and we couldn't go back to that. I called her friends to let them know what had happened, and I didn't hold anything back. I restrained my anger as best I could, but didn't lie for her sake. After using them as practice, I called our children and tried to gently but honestly tell them that I had found their mother and that she was with her lover, who was dying in a hospital bed. They didn't want to believe it, so I told them about the townhouse. When they asked if I could forgive her, I replied, maybe someday, but I'll never trust her again. I apologized to both of them but told them that I was divorcing their mother. Then, forgetting that they still had no way to contact her, I asked them not to tell her. I explained that she needed all the remaining time to be with him and rushing home wouldn't change anything. They argued with me, but eventually they understood. 2 weeks later, he died and Mari returned home, but I was no longer there. A week after her return, she was served with divorce papers. I hadn't left town, quit my job, or hidden from her. I had just moved into an apartment until I eventually found a place that suited me. I stayed close enough to the old house so the kids could visit both of us. Mari tried to change my mind and I let her try. She would come to my office or apartment begging me to reconsider, but my decision was final. She cried and made threats, but nothing changed. It lasted for 6 years, 6 years of betrayal, and if you count the lunches, dinners, and dancing, it was 7. In the end, it was the lying at least as much as the sex that destroyed our marriage. When I realized how well and how easily she had lied right to my face with a smile, I understood that she didn't look at me with the same loyalty with which I looked at her. It's been 2 years since the divorce was finalized. I don't ask, but the kids say their mother just goes to work and then home. She doesn't go out, or at least that's what they think. I feel sad that she's suffering, but I can't help her. To this day, I don't know if she mourns the loss of her first love or the marriage she betrayed. As for me, I'm not doing great either. I haven't healed, but the pain is slowly fading. I'm not dating, but I've started noticing other women, and I suspect that, in time, I'll dip my toe back into the dating pool. I'm far from trusting another woman outside of a professional setting. I will never know why she betrayed me, what she was missing, what I couldn't give her, or how she justified her actions. I suppose I could ask, but what's the point? It was her decision, and in some way she came to terms with it at the time. I've never told anyone about this because I doubt they would believe me even now, but I never learned his name. There was a man on his deathbed and a townhouse where my wife played house when they were together. For me, that was enough. You can't get revenge on the dead, and I realized I couldn't forgive the wife who betrayed me. That's the whole story. No elaborate twists, no revenge to plot, and no cure for the pain except time. This is what really happens when a spouse betrays you. There's no steel pipe to the knees, and no one gets sold to a Mexican brothel. There's only pain, doubt, and the feeling that somehow you failed.